Watch Forest focus. No doubt most Nottingham Forest fans have now seen Ramon Sosa introduced to the crowd before Saturday's game, as he looked genuinely thrilled to have joined the club. We'll discuss his transfer in full and what we can expect from the Paraguay international in the company of Ralph Hanna from the Guarani Vision podcast. How close did I get with the pronunciation there, Ralph?
Perfect. That was perfect.
Good to have you with us. How are you?
Yeah, I'm good, thanks. Thanks for having me on. Excited to talk about Ramon, who's kind of hit the headlines with everybody at the moment.
Excellent. We were saying before we started, I really want to hear your story a little bit first of how your Twitter bio says you're a Londoner who's is it Houston via Paraguay, and now you're to have your podcast with a few other guys. I see. How did it come to be? What's your bio as much as Ramon Sosa's?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, how did I end up watching Ramon Sosa playing football before kind of everyone knew about him? So I went to Paraguay when I was about 18 on like an exchange kind of visit, partly to improve my Spanish. And then I quite liked it. And I stayed, I think I was meant to stay 6 weeks, ended up staying about 6 months. Then came back to the UK, did uni, did all of that stuff. And over time, I found myself going to Paraguay now and again in summer holidays. And then I met my wife, or who's now my wife. So that kind of said, well, either she's coming over to England or I'm going over to Paraguay. And the weather was much better in Paraguay, so I ended up there. Fortunately, this was a time when kind of remote working wasn't very common, but my job did let me keep that. So I was doing remote working from Paraguay and at the same time following all the football. Eventually, through work, they kind of said you have to go to Miami because you can't be running this business from your bedroom in Paraguay. So I ended up in Miami for a long time. And then after the pandemic, we were kind of looking for something a bit different. We got 2 kids are quite older now, and they're in what we call middle school here, so secondary school. So we ended up coming out here to Houston, which is a bit more quieter than Miami, a bit more relaxed, a bit more family kind of environment. And here we are. And then yeah, but even from here, we keep up to date with all the Paraguayan kind of football, the community here in the US, which isn't particularly big. There's about 40,000 people. So it's actually the smallest kind of Hispanic group in the US is from Paraguay. But we do have a player here. So we got a player for the local club, Houston Dynamo, called Sebastian Ferreira. So there's always kind of Paraguayan and football is around, even though I'm maybe quite far away now in Houston.
Excellent. Interesting stuff. I guess plug your podcast at the end, obviously, and what you guys do. Just in terms of Ramon Sosa, then, just in general, what do you make of the deal? Obviously, not many fans over here had heard of him until a few weeks ago. Is it good business for Forest?
I think it has the potential to be really good business, because if we looked at the fee, I can't remember the exact because there's lots of add-ons, but we're talking about 15 million, 18 million, which in today's market isn't a huge amount, and especially not for a player that's already quite developed. He's 24 now, so it's not a player that you're not sure of how many games they've had. Will he be able to kind of adapt and all those kind of questions? That's maybe out there, but not as much as if it was, say, an 18, 19-year-old, like in the case of Brian Ojeda, who Forest signed a couple of years back. So I think it does have the potential. The really interesting thing about Ramon Sosa is, other than when he was at Olympia, he's never really been at what you would call a kind of a big club, right? He was at River Plate of Paraguay, is a very small club. They're historic, but very small. Gimnasia and then Talleres are not one of the big 5 in Argentina, which is probably why he's gone a bit under the radar. So in a way now, this is kind of his, well, of course it's his biggest challenge, but maybe it's also the first time that he'll start to have to perform at this really high standard. And so the question is, does he like jump over that barrier like he has at every stage in his career, or is he going to find it hard to adapt? Just where is his ceiling? I suppose we're going to find out very soon.
Just tell us a little bit about Paraguayan football in general. I guess you mentioned Brian Ojeda, who played over here. I was trying to think of Paraguayan famous players, and Chilavert springs to mind, and Roque Santa Cruz. Where does Paraguayan football rank in kind of South America, where it's such a powerhouse in Brazil and Argentina, obviously?
Yeah, so Paraguay is actually a very small country. of about 7-8 million people, kind of situated between those two big powers, Brazil and Argentina. So footballing wise, I think they've picked up a lot of that culture, and also from Uruguay, because they had a very influential Uruguayan manager in the early 90s. And Paraguay, really, I think they had their golden generation in the early 90s. So you talked about Chilavert, they had Roque Santa Cruz, who also ended up in Blackburn. He was 17 in 99 when he made his kind of national team debut. And then they got to their highest point in their history was the World Cup in 2010, where they just got beaten by Spain in the quarterfinals in a very tight match. And that Spanish team that won the World Cup say it was the hardest game they had the whole World Cup. Since then, they've been struggling a bit, partly because I think their size, there's just a natural thing with the generation, right? When you have that golden generation, trying to redo it, it's not the same as Brazil, Argentina have that huge pool of players. But I think what we've seen recently is a very big development. Because they're not doing very well at a national team level, there's been a big focus on youth development and getting those players more to standard to then be able to compete in the future. So what we've seen with that is Brian Ojeda is one example, but you have Julio and Ciso, who went directly from Libertad to Brighton. And you have Enzo Gonzalez, who also went from that same club, Libertad, direct to Wolves. So we've seen a couple of Paraguayan to Premier League transfers recently, which is slightly different to the traditional route, which is actually Ramon Sosa's route of usually going to Argentina as your next step and then trying to make a jump to Europe. Miguel Almiron's a good example. He did go to Atlanta, but before that he was in Lanús in Argentina, where he won a couple of tournaments, and then he made his jump to the Premier League.
I didn't realise. I should have known that. And Ciso was Paraguayan. He's a good player. So yeah, we've got some good players. That's interesting. In terms of his style of play, like I don't know if you follow the Premier League or not, but obviously we played Bournemouth at the weekend. Callum Hudson-Odoi was looking really bright, and Anthony Elanga on the other wing. Then we had to take one off through injury. The other one was tiring. We didn't have a like-for-like replacement. Is Sosa kind of like Hudson-Odoi, that very direct runner, will take players on, will cut inside, will look to shoot, or is he a different kind of winger from what you've seen?
No, that's exactly it. I think that's where he's been brought in to kind of be a backup or a replacement for those two players that you mentioned, or also to try and push them a bit, right? To give a bit of competition for places. His natural idea is to get the ball and try and take people on. I think he gave his first interview, or the first interview was released for Forest, and he mentioned that. He said, "I'm a guy that likes to take people on," and that's really been a very like classic winger, trying to isolate the fullbacks. He will cut inside. He's really good on both feet. So he plays on the left wing. He's right-footed, but his left is actually very good. He's pretty much both-footed. So you could also see them trying to use him on the right as well. That could work. And where he really improved, I think, in Talleres was that final pass and that kind of extra goal contribution. So it's not just cutting in and shooting. It's actually looking for space, looking for opportunities. And that's where he really matured as a player while he was at Talleres.
Any weaknesses that you would see? I mean, the Premier League has the reputation for being, fast and physical. Obviously, I don't see much Argentinian football. Does it translate? Does he have that skill set, or is it something he's going to have to work on?
Yeah, I think the biggest thing he's going to have to work on is the sort of tactical and defensive side of his game. He's actually quite big for a winger, or for a South American winger. He's 5'10", so he's taller than Ojeda, he's taller than Enciso, Enzo Gonzalez, he's taller than Miguel Almiron. So in terms of all these other Paraguayan players, he's actually bigger, and he's looking quite bulky at the moment. When I just saw him in his recent interview, so he's probably got a bit more physical presence than we saw. In fact, he scored a couple of headers for Talleres, so he's even got that part of his game. But so the physical side, I'm maybe not as worried about, but it's more the defensive side, and where he was given pretty much a free role, especially in Talleres, because he was becoming such a key player in the attack. He didn't have to track back as much. So I could imagine that's where it might be harder. Just interestingly, Paraguay played the Copa America, and he wasn't getting the starts in that Copa America team. And you felt it's because the coach, two of their first two games were against Colombia and Brazil, and the coach felt that he needed wingers that were going to be able to defend and track back a bit. Interestingly, he came on against Colombia in the second half, and he provided an assist for their goal. And then he scores his first goal in his start that he gets against Costa Rica in the final game. So I think that's what we're looking to work on is a defensive side of his game.
Does he arrive match fit? Because I know obviously the season's ongoing there. It seems like we'll get into how the transfer played out, but he hasn't played for a couple of weeks, has he?
Yeah, exactly. So after the Copa America, he didn't want to play, I think, because he was worried about injury as negotiations were clearly going on at the time. So his last match, the Costa Rica match, was 2nd of July. So he's had a while that he hasn't played any games. In terms of fitness, obviously he's been training, so he's still got that. I would imagine, I don't know how it will work out, but I would imagine we don't really see much of him until after the international break coming up, the one in September, because that seems the perfect time for him to almost have a preseason in terms of training with Forest and then maybe get some game time after that.
Just talk to us about the transfer then. Following it on this side of the world, it seemed like it was done, and then there was negotiations over the money, and then, like you say, he didn't want to play. It sounded very complicated. Have Talleres got a reputation being particularly hard to negotiate transfers with, or was it just kind of a unique deal?
I think it was a unique situation from everything that went through. It really starts back in January. So in January, there was a lot of interest. I think Everton were mentioned as one of the clubs. And that was obvious because he'd done so well in World Cup qualifiers and the Copa Libertadores. So not just in the Argentinian league, in high-level games, he was performing very well. And so in January, I think Talleres, they had like almost a gentleman's agreement with him and saying, give us 6 more months because we're doing Copa Libertadores and we want to kind of push on this. That's the most important tournament economically. It's like the version of the Champions League. And then we'll let you go in the next window. So that seemed to be the gentleman's agreement. During, I think it's the Copa America, something very strange happens. He posts an Instagram story saying that his agent is no longer his agent. And it's a story, so it obviously disappears after 24 hours. And then people try and find out who his agent is. And there was a rumor that it was Jorge Mendes, which would make sense, right, with Nuno. Mm. But then nothing ever happened with that, came of it. And what I understand is he did end up staying with his current agent, who, by the way, is the same agent as Miguel Almiron. As this is all going on, because of the gentleman's agreement, Talleres said, yeah, we're not playing him. We've agreed that he's going to get ready. He's making his transfer. We're happy for him to leave. And then after 2 weeks, it seems Talleres, for whatever reason, said, look, we can't let this go on anymore. You're going to have to play against River Plate in the Copa Libertadores. And that's when Sosa puts his foot down and said, I'm not playing. I'm not playing, which suggested, okay, the negotiations are still going on. Now that the kind of dust has settled, I think we've seen what happened. Talleres didn't own 100% of the players. So some of the money's gone back to the very first club he played for in Paraguay, which is called Tembetaru, they're in the 2nd division at the moment, 3rd division when he broke through. But also he actually owned part of his rights. And so what he did in the final after the transfer, he donated, and I think it's over $1 million. He donated that back to Talleres. I don't know. Yeah, my feeling, I think, as you just said, okay, my feeling is maybe that's where things were breaking down and that's what he needed to do to kind of get things over the line.
Interesting. Well, he's here now. So, yeah, so that's good. Looking forward to seeing him play. Like I said at the top of the show, he was really, I don't know if you've seen the footage, he looked really emotional, really happy to be here, really soaked up the atmosphere. I mean, is it the dream of every young kid growing up in Paraguay to play in Europe, to play in the Premier League, just to play in South America and see what happens? How does it work for the kind of the player development over in that side of the world?
Yeah, I think the Premier League is still, I feel, and as far as you can see from Paraguayans, that's still the major league that everybody aims for. It's the one people want to go for. I think it was Fox Sports that began showing the Premier League in the early 2000s. So thinking from that generation onwards, that's been one of the main kind of European leagues that people end up watching. And there is that idea that obviously the Premier League sells that they're the best league in the world. And I think that does kind of filter into people's imaginations in Paraguay. And for sure, Europe is the major destination. So players, somebody like Ramon Sosa, getting his move to Argentina was huge for him because at the time he wasn't actually doing that well at Olympia. He was having like good performances, but he wasn't very consistent. But the Gimnasia coach had coached him at Olympia and he brought him over to Argentina. So often that's maybe like the first step, but that's never going to be the last step for a player, especially of his age and his talent. It's always like, how can I get to Europe? How can I get to Europe? And the Premier League for most of the players is the pinnacle, because of the kind of competition and knowing that you have players at the moment, you have players in Serie A, you have players in La Liga, but they're playing with all due respect for Getafe and for Torino. So you're not playing for a team that's won the European Championship twice, right? So it's very different to that kind of level of competitiveness where Paraguayan players find themselves.
Yeah, I do want to come on to how Forest are viewed, but one other question about Sosa, which would hopefully be an interesting barometer for fans who don't know much about him. I've asked this to correspondents like yourself or players who signed for different leagues. If someone had said to you at the start of the summer, Sosa's going to the Premier League, this is contingent on you following a lot of Premier League football, I guess, but what kind of club would you have said he's good enough to play for them? Is it a top 6 club? Is it a West Ham, a Brentford, or a promoted club? Where would you be pitching him in the league table?
Yeah, it's a good question. It's also where he fits in because of his style. So you have to have a coach that enjoys using wingers and is happy to have maybe some of that defensive imbalance, as we're talking about, with him not being that much of a defensive player. I mean, the natural place we would say for everybody is Brighton, because Brighton seem to sign on the South Americans. But yeah, I agree. I wouldn't see him. You wouldn't see him in a top 6 club. Or you could see him go there, but it would be a huge gamble because we don't know his ceiling, right? So far, every challenge he's been given, he seems to have got over, especially with the recent Copa America. I think having the assist and the goal in those 3 games kind of suggested he's still able to maintain his level at a very, very competitive standard with the teams being Brazil, Colombia, Costa Rica. It wasn't particularly easy. But the question is more, where can he actually get some minutes, some playing time to show what he can do? And so I think somewhere around the mid-table clubs is where you could feel him fitting in, as long as you have a coach that works for him. So this is really interesting that he gets Nuno, who, doesn't necessarily speak Spanish, but there's a bit more of a South American contingent building up at Forest, and he's not being thrown in like in the case of Ojeda. When he went, it was totally different. I mean, Ojeda was very complicated because I think Chris Hughton signed him and then Cooper came in. And so he kind of had a manager that didn't really need him. Enzo Gonzalez signed for Wolves last year, and obviously Gary O'Neill's not fluent in Spanish, so Enzo Gonzalez found it very hard. He didn't make any games. He's just done his ACL at the Olympics, so we haven't seen much of him. So I think this seems to be a good fit, and it's not just about the club standard. It's more actually the kind of environment he's going to be entering.
Hopefully so. Just lastly, then, you mentioned about the Premier League and how players view it. Forest haven't been in the Premier League for 20 odd years, so for fans where you are in the States, probably might not know much about Forest and South America as well. How are Forest viewed in Paraguay, but I guess also in America where you are?
Yeah, so firstly in Paraguay, it's surprising. So Olimpia is the most successful team in Paraguay, and they won their first Copa Libertadores in 1979. So obviously they were meant to face Forest in the Intercontinental Cup, and then they end up playing Malmo because of the whole kind of, I think that all dates back to the 60s when Racing and Celtic had that big battle, and then United had the big battle a year later. So the English teams didn't want to play that game. But I think people know Forest from that, the kind of older generation. Then you have maybe the gap like you're talking about, because Forest weren't in the Premier League. I think when they start showing it again regularly on Paraguayan TV, there's not that biggest fan base. The big fan base is, as you might expect, Arsenal, Chelsea, United, City. Now there's more and more Liverpool. They're kind of the teams that most people will follow. I'm actually part of the Arsenal Paraguay Supporters Club, and we've got over 150 signed up members at the moment, which is pretty good for that size of population. And then in the US, I think, it's big. I mean, the Premier League is huge. They've done a great job in how they sell their international TV rights, and especially in the US, I think NBC have the rights. They're really good. They do live events. they're very good at this whole Premier League mornings because obviously they're kind of trying to win the morning slot against American football, college football, which is on Saturdays, usually starting around noon. But they're like just before. They usually get their games in just before the Premier League. And so they've built up, there's huge clubs, supporters clubs around the whole country in all different big cities. So I think you'd be surprised if you ended up in America, you'd find plenty of Forest fans who aren't necessarily like me, kind of expats, just people that for whatever reason have ended up following the club.
Yeah, I was looking on Spotify for our demographics. Actually, like 4% of our audience is in the States, which doesn't sound a lot, but yeah, I think that's quite a lot. And 3% in Australia, and obviously there is an expat element as well, but especially in the States, like you say, I bet people are latching onto it because there's a whole Robin Hood story and things we can market ourselves around, I guess, which Americans would find interesting. Just before we go, I should give a quick word for our sponsors, the Trent Navigation. Very professional game, almost the end of the podcast and forgetting them. But the Wolves game on the 31st of August, straight after that is the Oasis Isn't gig. They've played there before very successfully, went down really well. So get down straight after full time if you can. Barbecue, food court, outside bars. And as Greg was saying on yesterday's podcast, they've got so many members of staff now. You don't have to queue for anything. You can get your beer in quickly. So, enjoy that. Here's a question. I'm going off on a tangent. I always go off on a tangent. How does English sporting culture compare to American sporting culture where you are in terms of tailgate parties? And also, I assume you've been to watch games in Paraguay, is it pretty wild in the crowd? I kind of imagine people get massively into it.
Yeah. Firstly, here in the US, it's totally different culture. I mean, ticket prices are so expensive, and that's before you add on parking. And so, because of parking, you have the whole tailgate experience as you were talking about. It's very different. I think one thing that really surprised me, I haven't seen it so much in football, but definitely I've been to NFL games and NBA games, is people just show up in a random team shirt that is either the opponent, like the away team, or it's just a random one that has nothing to do with it, and there's no problems. I've never seen any issues, which of course for me that was very strange, like coming from England and the way we manage away supporters and all that kind of thing. In Paraguay, very passionate as maybe you would expect with South America. They picked up a lot, I would say, of Argentinian fan culture, because Argentinian fan culture seems to have kind of spread through most of South America, and people have latched onto that in terms of the organized groups, the songs, having the band in there. At the moment, Paraguay, what we've noticed, we've been talking about this on our podcast, there hasn't been huge attendances because Olimpia and Cerro are the two big teams, and they haven't been doing as well. There's another team, Libertad, who have won the last kind of three, 4 titles, or 4 of the last 5 or something. And so that seems to have had a bit of a dip in attendance, but traditionally it's hugely popular. And we've got the Paraguay playing Brazil in their next home game from the World Cup qualifiers. The cheapest tickets are $7 or equivalent. So that's actually, even for Paraguay, pretty good. I think we'll see a very big crowd for that game.
Excellent. Interesting stuff. As you said there about your podcast, just before we go, tell us a little bit about it if people want to check it out.
Yeah, like many people, we set up a podcast during the pandemic, and it's to talk about Paraguayan football in English. So we're at the moment the only kind of outlet that talks about Paraguayan football in English. We cover things like Ramon Sosa and players doing well in foreign leagues, and also the bit of the local league. A lot of focus on the national team, especially when just the Copa America and the Olympics, and now with World Cup qualifiers coming up. And it's called Guarani Vision. You can find us on YouTube, Spotify, and we have a Twitter account as well.
Excellent stuff. If people have enjoyed this, as ever, do us a favor and hit like on the video. It makes a massive difference. Do subscribe. You can become a channel member, and I do enjoy reading any good 5-star iTunes review. Nothing less than 5 stars. Don't enjoy reading those, but I'll certainly take them. No problem. We shall be back tomorrow, hopefully with Paul Anderson, but we'll work out something if not. And then back on Thursday with a match preview for Southampton, then a Southampton opposition view on Friday, and then a post-match view on Saturday. So, full steam ahead. No worries on that front. Ralph, thank you very much. Really interesting story that you've got, and really enjoyed chatting to you.
Thanks, Matt. Yeah, thanks for having me on. It was a pleasure.
No problem at all. No problem. Have a good day, everyone. If we don't see you tomorrow, then we shall see you soon.